Hello and welcome to the B2B Unlock podcast. Today we're joined by John Lovell, Managing Director of Lovell Consulting, a leading specialist and consultant in capital allowances. Good to have you here, John.
Thank you, Marcel. Good to be here.
Pleasure. With over 30 years of experience, you have established Lovell Consulting as a trusted name in the UK and Ireland, helping businesses maximize tax relief on commercial property assets through expert valuations and advice. And today I want to learn how you did it. So let's start with asking you, how did you even get into capital allowances?
Thank you. I think it's fair to say very few people would start off their career and say, I really want to work in capital allowances. It's not quite up there in terms of being a doctor or a dentist. So in my own case, I finished school a year early. I jumped a year at school and I'd always been interested in construction. And so I spent a year working with a building company. And I did all manner of things. Sometimes I was working on building sites, trimming pile caps, laying drains. I was also working in a drawing office, doing technical drawings, helping to estimate simple building costs, and so on. So that gave me a very good foundation year into construction. I then went to Reading University, studied quantity surveying, got a degree in that. And then in my final year, there was a gentleman who was from Oxford University, from the Major Projects Association, and I was interested in what he was doing, project management, and I applied to Oxford and I managed to get a full scholarship where I was one of the early pre-MBA students. So MBAs now have been at Oxford University for a long time. It was a pioneering time. And then after that, I decided I'd like to get qualified as a chartered surveyor. So I worked in Oxford for a firm of surveyors, got qualified. And then it was a tough time in the UK economy around 1992 when I qualified. And I thought I would really like to specialize in some area using my knowledge of construction, surveying, management. And it was a very early stage in capital allowances, and I happened to see an advert in a building magazine, and it was from what was then a large accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, and they said they were looking to take a team of people with construction property knowledge and train them in tax to work in capital allowances. Now, I had very limited experience of capital allowances at that time, and I thought, well, I'll apply. And I didn't succeed. They were looking for somebody with a lot more knowledge. But I was then very fortunate that the person that they did recruit, he was my boss, Philip Fibush, he recruited me, and I learned about capital allowances back in the early 1990s. And then I worked in the tax team, and it was a fantastic foundation. We were working with very bright people, and it was a new field. And pretty much at that time in the early 90s, they were the first of the accounting firms to have a specialist team. Because the problem with capital allowances is it spans property knowledge and it spans accounting tax knowledge. And pretty much up till that point, people had been doing it with a lot of construction knowledge, limited tax knowledge, or they'd been doing it with very detailed tax knowledges, but not really understanding construction and property. And it was an exciting time because we could basically go into any company, whatever the size, small or huge, and we were saving them very fundamental amounts due to our specialist knowledge. And that kind of, everyone at that stage, it was like the early stages of the internet, but it was, for me anyhow, and certainly the people around me, it was a fascinating time. Capital allowances, sort of 30 years on, is a lot more established. Many accounting firms, certainly the larger firms, will have in-house specialists, but back then we were kind of pioneering. There were one or two other specialist firms at that point, but they'd all pretty much come from a surveying background, and we were the first to really integrate well with surveying and tax.
It's always very interesting to me.
After being there for about just under 5 years, I decided to set up my own firm, Lovell Consulting. back in 1997. I was an early pioneer of home working. I worked from home because I had space at home and it was affordable. But my personal perspective, I'm very much in favor of working in an office environment. I have a team at Lovell Consulting. We're just under 15 people, and we find that by working together physically in the same space, we're able to solve problems and in a very collaborative manner.
You were one of the pioneers when it comes to remote working back then.
Yes, it was, as I say, it was on affordability grounds rather than, but interestingly, it did have a plus side because I outgrew what was then my home and I needed office space, and it led me into purchasing commercial property. So separately from Lovell Consulting, I do have a commercial property business. And I don't think that would have ever happened if it hadn't have been for setting up Lovell Consulting. And there is a very nice synergy between consulting businesses and property businesses. The two businesses can work very well in parallel.
It's always fascinating to me, like how such a thing, such as an ad, kind of determines the direction of your life, and being kind of in that place at that time, seeing that ad, applying for it, and going in that direction. That's always very, very fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, if it hadn't been for seeing that ad in a trade magazine, I would not be working in this area. Very unlikely. I was fortunate that the recruitment agent, who I'm still in contact with 35 years later, he followed up with me, and I wasn't the right person for the first position. I didn't have the relevant experience, and I was very fortunate to work with a gentleman, Philip Fibush, who was very knowledgeable, still is very knowledgeable in this area, albeit he doesn't practice capital allowances anymore, certainly not day to day.
Okay. Going into the deeper level of capital allowances, right? To help us understand what is it and how does it work? How does it actually help companies or individuals? Can you give us some examples maybe on that as well?
Well, capital allowances, first thing to say is most countries have some form of capital allowances. And the UK system is like a lot of the UK taxes is relatively complicated, but there are some benefits. The benefits of the UK is we now have a system which gives quite fast tax relief particularly for anyone who spends money on building works. It can be a little bit less generous for people who buy buildings, but you can still get tax savings. Essentially, governments around the world, they have tried to give a tax incentive to people who invest in the economy. However, you, Marcel, you go out and buy a computer at the simple end of the scale, you might pay 1,000 euros or whatever your currency is. And in pretty much every jurisdiction in the world, you will get tax relief on that £1,000 that you have spent. Now, you don't need a capital allowances specialist, or in the US, we're called cost segregation specialists, different labels, different countries. The form of capital allowances that I practice is broadly similar in a lot of the English-speaking world or countries that the UK historically had links with. So, for instance, Australia has a form of capital allowances. Ireland has a lot of African countries, Hong Kong, Singapore. They have variations of UK capital allowances, but very often the root came from very old English tax law. Capital allowances have been around since the 1700s. They're not something that has just been invented. But going back to the example of the computer, a lot of capital allowances are very simple, very routine. They're claimed on physical assets, things like cars, things like tables, equipment, furniture. Now, you don't need a specialist to claim those allowances because you'll have an invoice and it will say whatever the figure is. It's not complicated, it's very straightforward. So all accountants will claim capital allowances. The complexity comes to when their clients buy buildings. So they might buy a building, say £10 million. There will very unlikely be a detailed segregation of the plant and machinery in that building that belongs to the landlord. So the lift is probably not being separately valued. And the same with the air conditioning. That is why capital allowances, when people buy buildings, has become quite complex, quite specialist. And there'll be some buildings, because of the tax history and the type of building, there'll be zero allowances. But there'll be other buildings, when you buy them, there could be allowances of, say, 40% or more of the purchase price at the other extreme. And it's the same when people carry out building works. So if I was to refurbish this office, I would have some simple invoices again for the furniture and nothing complex. But my invoices to the builder would probably just say building works. They would not be segregated into all the assets, such as repairs. And you get certain capital allowances at different speeds. So the objective is to accelerate the allowances into the fastest tax relief. Now, this is not a scheme. It's not something that's artificial. As I mentioned, it's something, all governments, any sensible government perhaps, other than Korea, would want you to invest in their economy. And so the carrot is you invest in our economy in a tax-paying structure. So that's an individual, a partnership, a company. Then you will benefit from tax relief on some of your investment. So it's as simple as that, but they make it quite complex.
Yeah, of course. Probably as for every government in the world, the higher sum you spend, the more complicated it is. They can make sure that they still make money, but of course, they want you to be moving that economy, so they need to give you some relief. But I understand, like for anything, even for our instance, for like business expenses and just basic business operations, you already need to have skilled accountant to make sure that you're using all the diets and all the tools available, right? So I can just barely imagine like how complex it must be for such a big investment, right?
Yes, in the UK, we do not have a kind of statute-based system for capital allowances. There is legislation, there is statute, there's the Capital Allowances Act, but it doesn't define what expenditure is on plants and machinery. Instead, it tends to define what is expenditure on buildings, which you get in some cases at a much slower tax relief. And so they were reliant on case law. So there's normally at least one or two capital allowances case every year going through the courts. Sometimes those cases then get appealed. So it's, since I started in my career in capital allowances over that 30 plus years, there must have been at least 30 plus cases relating to capital allowances. So, that's the same not just in the UK, but other jurisdictions as well that will also have cases. So it's a question of keeping up to date, and also technology changes. So there's been a lot of cases in the last 5 years in the UK about tends to be complex civil engineering type projects, power stations. There was a one in the last few months about a seawall as to whether that was plant machinery. It is a lot of capital allowances is far, there's a lot greater clarity than there was when I started my career. When I started, there was maybe only one or two texts on capital allowances, very limited information. Now there's a whole series of books. Some of them are very good. Some of them have been written by my competitors, and they've been very well written. And HMRC now does publish their own internal guidance as well. So there's a lot more clarity than there was 30 years ago, but there is still some areas of subjectivity.
Yeah. And if you're dealing with such big deals, it's still always best to have someone that's specialist on your side, or as yourself, like a consultant that can kind of help you make sure that you're not making some rookie mistakes that would kind of lead to these cases, right?
Absolutely. And, we're only interested as a firm in those cases where we can add value. So sometimes an accountant will maybe refer their client to us, and we may just say, look, all you need to do is this. It's very simple. We don't need to be involved. Or there'll be other cases who say, look, this is really complicated. We will send you and your client a proposal. We'll detail in that what the savings are going to be and what the fee will be. So I personally only want to do cases where there's a demonstrated value add for what me and my colleagues do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You always need to be bringing in value, and pretty much I'd say the fees and the kind of work that you deliver always determine how much you can actually save the client so they can see the value in the proposals and what you actually help them with outside of also the time and the clarity, right? And not getting into some unexpected problems. But what kind of interests me here is that you mentioned, like, of course, there's some cases that just need some very small items or small help. There's some cases that need big help. So how do you see the current trends in different commercial properties in the UK, right? And also such trends such as sustainability, mixed use development. Is that kind of acting the demand for your services, or how does it all come together?
Yeah, that's quite a complicated question, Marcel. But look, there's certainly for larger companies and companies that operate in different jurisdictions, the environment is quite important to them. And
Yeah.
we have these things called EPC rating of buildings. And I think it's fair to say that for the larger corporates, has become very important for them. And so for those kind of larger global companies, that I would say they're tending to move to newly built properties where they will have the best environmental EPC ratings. And that will be because they've got triple glazing, they've got completely new, efficient air conditioning, heating, low energy lighting systems. And for a certain class of clients, they want those top quality buildings. And also post-COVID, you're seeing the kind of what I refer to as the hotelization of office buildings. The days of having very boring offices that almost look like horizontal coffins with a white raised ceiling and a metal raised floor, and they'd just be basically a horizontal coffin. Those days, I think, have gone. People's expectations, where do people like hanging out? In coffee shops, in bars, in restaurants, in hotels. And I think what you're seeing is landlords are having to invest a lot more money to improve the EPC ratings of buildings, but secondly, to make their buildings a lot more attractive, to continue to encourage people to return to offices. I think that there's been a global shift. They argue, a lot of employers are moving more towards office-based working, as we touched on before, but they recognize those offices have to be interesting places, and they're providing some flexibility as well. In the office, I think the strong argument is the default position for working with some variations. And clearly it depends on the size of building, type of industry, there's fluctuations. But to link to your original question, people are having to spend more to make their buildings greener, more efficient, and they're having to spend a lot more to improve the ambience, to make them attractive spaces in which to spend their time away from home. So I would say those are the two trends. So I think we will continue to see more completely new build projects, or if it's existing buildings, they'll be stripped back right to the shell and then be completely refitted. So we are working on a whole mix of complete new builds and renovations. Same with hotels, it's the same story. It's either a complete new build, very efficient, or it is complete strip out of maybe a building that's in a good location, but retaining, say, an attractive or a listed facade. Same with residential. There's been a big shift in the UK. Buy-to-let, private individual landlords have been punished in the tax system and there's been very much a shift to large glass towers, typically, or brick towers, which there's the private rental sector. We're working on a lot of those residential towers. So I would say those are kind of the main shifts. We're also doing a lot as a firm on energy projects, things like wind farms, solar farms, battery storage projects, and waste to energy plants. We've worked on some very significant waste to energy plants. So I would say the real shift in my career and as a firm is the actual volume that we're now doing in the energy sector.
So actually the wind farms and all these sustainability solutions outside of just like kind of being the ATC factor and being something to consider with the regular commercial buildings, there's actually so many requests for literally like energy services and energy commercial buildings. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, as a firm, we work on a whole variety of projects, from the quite small to the super large, and we sometimes work on projects outside the UK. So we've been working on a very significant mining facility in South America, which is subject to UK tax. It's owned through a UK company. So we do occasionally get to work on projects overseas, which is subject to UK tax. We also do a fair amount of work in Southern Ireland, which has a similar but different capital allowances regime.
How does the consultancy services that you offer or the kind of work that you need to deliver for these specific commercial buildings change across these new trends? Like, do you see there's a lot more work with these energy commercial buildings, or what is the kind of switch there in terms of your delivery?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes those complex power plants are relatively straightforward from a capital allowances perspective because they're almost all plant and machinery. So there's almost less segregation than there is if somebody fits out maybe a small coffee shop. So the extent of analysis work that we do is not always directly linked to the size and the value of a particular project. A lot depends on the quality of the information. And there's an interesting relationship that almost the larger the construction project, there's an inverse relationship between the quality of the cost documentation that you get. So we will sometimes work on a project that might be 300, 500 million or more, and you would think that there's going to be fantastic breakdowns and analysis of the costs, and all you will get is 5 lines.
Wow.
And so you have to then visit the property, you have to make our own detailed assessments. What you'll find is that on those very large projects, the information is regarded by the contractors as being commercially sensitive, and they will do effectively design and build, or they will just give a price to build a complete facility. And unless we've been involved pre-procurement, the quality is really surprising. Whereas in contrast, going back to say a small coffee shop, you might get 20 pages of breakdowns of the costs. You know, they'll tell you what each individual toilet costs and each individual light fitting on a room by room basis. So I find very often on the smaller projects, there's a lot more information. On the bigger projects, we as a firm have to do a lot more specialist work.
So you would actually recommend someone building a commercial property, and the bigger the property, bigger recommendations to kind of seek services such as yours to make sure that you're getting the tax allowance on anything that's going to go into that project.
Yes, I think the big thing that's changed in my 30 plus years is when I started, you know, I would maybe approach someone and say, look, I can see you're building this hotel. And I'd say, look, I'm a capital allowances specialist. They would never have heard a capital allowances specialist, most people 30 years ago. And they say, okay, yeah, that's very interesting, John, but I've got my accountants, they will do it. And it was kind of frustrating because at that time, we kind of knew their accountants didn't really have the skills. They would claim some allowances, but they would miss a very significant amount. But what has changed now is a lot more business people recognize that they need to have a capital allowances specialist. And so it's a little bit like planning. Say 30, 40, 50 years ago, people would have said, my architect can get me planning. That's what my architect does. So a bit like, okay, my accountant will get me the capital allowances. Now, there's very few sophisticated clients now that would let their architects do the planning. You know, planning has become so complicated that there are planning specialists, and I myself use planning specialists. And then there's lobbying specialists who will work alongside the planning specialist to lobby the council and engage with the public to help get the planning. So I think most clients now will have heard of capital allowances as a separate discipline. So, you know, we do get people, even like quite small businesses, husband and wife type businesses, they will know, or they'll have read somewhere that we need a capital allowances specialist, and they'll find me either from a recommendation or sometimes even from Google. But there's a lot more, you know, it's not a household name. You know, if you go and get your hair cut and someone says, what do you do? And you say capital allowances, they probably will not have heard of it. So there's not high street recognition. But for anybody who is engaging regularly and buying buildings, constructing, refurbishing buildings, either they or their accountants, the argument has been won. People recognize that you need specialist advice. A little bit like, I know dentists used to do root canals, but these days any sensible dentist, they're likely to send you off to someone who just does root canals all day. But I would say capital allowances are a lot more interesting than root canals.
It pretty much reminds me like, of course, if you have a certain illness, you go to the specialist, the doctor. So why wouldn't you have like a specialist on such a big problem, right? Or such a big opportunity to also save some costs. So it makes so much sense.
It does, but sometimes and very often, if someone comes to us direct, we will tend to go to them and say, look, we want your accountant, your tax advisor to be in the loop because you're coming to us for specialist advice, right? We can give you that specialist advice, but your accountant understands your overall wider affairs. You know, we don't do tax. We do valuation of capital allowances. We will calculate those capital allowances in conjunction with your existing accountants and tax advisors. We're not going to replace them. They carry on doing all the good stuff that they do, filing the accounts, filing the tax returns, dealing with HMRC. So it is really important for any specialist that the generalist is involved. And, you know, we do a lot of Teams calls. Hugely strong about this is we really need to keep their day-to-day accounts and day-to-day tax advisor in the loop before we get an appointment.
Absolutely. Yeah. It just makes so much sense because they can provide you with all the necessary information that
well,
much
they have the wider
quicker.
background. So no, we don't want to be doing capital allowances for someone and saying, look, we get all these savings, and then we find out that they've got tax losses for the next 10 years. We're not going to save them anything until 10 years' time. So it is crucial that their general advisors are in the mix.
Yeah. I think based on that, the person or the company or the person now building some commercial properties know exactly what to do on the capital allowance based on what you just said. Is there any difference, or what are maybe the strategies for someone trying to buy the commercial property in the UK or Ireland? Is there any specific strategy outside of what you just mentioned, or how does that work?
I mean, look, I've been saying there's a lot more awareness of capital allowances, which is true, but that does not extend to people who are buying for the first time in the UK. Who, you know, currently we're finding that there's a lot of people from Israel buying commercial property here, and it may be the first time that they've bought. So they don't really understand how the UK system works. I mean, they learn very fast, particularly if we're briefing them. So I would say it's really important for people who are new to the UK that they have somebody who sets out early how it works.
Mhm.
And one of the things we're able to do for all of our clients is to do cash flows of how the benefits will accrue over time.
Okay. Yeah. So pretty much at any given point, and whenever you're basically buying or developing property, there's always good to be informed even beforehand, so you can actually prepare and calculate better.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Perfect. How does your company specifically assist client in navigating the complexities of it? Can you give us some examples or a few interesting case studies?
Yes. Well, we're a relatively small firm. We're quick and we're nimble, and we purely specialize in this area,
Mhm.
and that gives us a real advantage. So I tend to compare it to flowers. So you can buy flowers from a petrol station.
Mhm.
Now, it's a brave person that gives their loved one flowers from a petrol station.
Yeah.
If you want to get really good flowers, you go to a shop that only sells flowers.
Yeah.
And then you can go to them and say, I know the first thing they'll probably ask you is, how much do you want to spend? Now, no one will ever ask you that question in a petrol station or in a supermarket. You just buy what's on display.
Mhm.
So what we do is very bespoke. We work with our clients, and we are the equivalent of a specialist flower shop or a specialist wine shop. We work on a huge variety of cases, from quite small projects. A few days ago, you would have seen me wearing a white coat with a hairnet going around a catering facility. And there someone had a leasehold interest, so they didn't own the building, but they spent quite a lot of money fitting out that space. And, it was complex. There's cold rooms, there were mezzanine floors, there was specialist paneling on the walls. And, I find that quite enjoyable. That's a small case. The
Mhm.
bigger ends, I worked for the government on one of their high security buildings. This was some time back. They had very specialist security features that you wouldn't normally get in a normal building. It was occupied by the government but had been built by the private sector. It was large, it was complex, and it was very different to conventional office building. So we have such variety of buildings. We kind of cover everything from beginning of life fertility clinics right through to end of life facilities and pretty much every commercial operation in between. And so
Mhm.
I do enjoy meeting clients and going around unusual buildings.
Mhm.
My favorite buildings, probably restaurants and hotels. You tend to see the most innovative design I find in the hospitality sector.
I can imagine myself like probably as well enjoying just being able to go into the outside world and kind of enjoy these new properties, see how they kind of being built, and even get the insight of like, okay, what was actually spent here, how much this did cost, right? Kind of like overall structure of it and the contract, right? So that might be quite exciting.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Like, there's many very creative people, some great architects, interior designers, and we see buildings very often at the beginning. So someone
Mhm.
buys a building and will value the capital allowances at that stage. And then we will see the project right through from construction. So we will see it while it's a building site right through to completed operating facility. And so, yeah, I find that fascinating. So on the larger projects, they will span accounting years.
Mhm.
Very often we will be doing maybe 3 or 4 capital allowances analysis until that project is completely finished.
Very nice. And I'm very interesting because of course, there are companies that are getting into the business, they're developing or buying something. They're probably aware of you and other capital allowance experts being on the market. So I'm guessing mostly they're going to you, right? And I'd be interested, like how you differentiate yourself from your competitors, and maybe how do you acquire new partnerships outside of just kind of waiting who will come with what?
Yeah, I mean, look, we do have other competitors.
Yeah.
The shift in my career is that the larger accounting firms will tend to have specialists in-house.
Yeah.
In when I started, there was just like one or two firms that had the specialism in-house, and then there were quite a few independent firms. Now, I would say what differentiates Lovell Consulting is we've been around for this year, it'll be 28 years, and we only offer that one service. So we are quite well known now as a firm, and I would say we have a pretty good reputation, a strong reputation with existing clients. Most of our clients, our new clients, come from recommendations or their referrals from other clients, other accounting firms, sometimes lawyers, occasionally from bankers. And in the UK, I think it takes quite a long time to be accepted. And I think we've gone beyond that. So, it takes probably at least 15 years to have credibility in any service area in the UK. And so we've done that for a long period. We're quick, we're efficient, so we try to be fair with our charging and very transparent. So we tend to have long established relationships. And in contrast, the very large accounting firms, they are a lot slower. It takes them a long time to sign up a new client. They have a lot of processes, internal processes, and we can be much quicker. We can be more flexible in our pricing. For instance, we have never had time charging as a basis. Exceptional clients, very seldom. There's a handful of clients that want us to look at something on a time basis. The vast majority of our work is on pre-agreed fixed fees or on a success percentage. We do not know what it's cost us to do a piece of work. We have an idea, but so it doesn't impact the service that we give. So, whatever basis we work with a client, they will get the same service.
Okay. It's very interesting. But you're running some of your own outbound outside of just the recommendations, right? Because of course our listeners would be interested in like how you can make it work, even if of course you have some reputation, you've been on the market for a bit, you have some case studies you can leverage, but how do you kind of get in front of the right people that are kind of looking at this point, or how do you at least establish relationships when the time comes?
Yeah. Well, we do our own webinars. We've always done historically quite a lot of seminars. Pre-COVID, they were all face-to-face. Then we shifted COVID and post-COVID much more to online platforms. Our new clients, we publicize those quite widely. We post stuff on LinkedIn. As I say, we also speak at other platforms like we're doing today with you. Marcel, but in the old days, I would have sent out marketing letters to people. I would have sent lots of emails to people. We don't do that now. I don't find it an effective way of marketing. Marketing tends to be, as I say, through the internet in terms of doing technical webinars and also our reputation. So, we are not a marketing-led firm. There are some capital allowances firms out there who will have maybe a team of 20, 30 people who are just full-time salespeople. We do not have a single salesperson in this organization.
Yeah.
We are technical-led. So that is the contrast. And, I think clients like that. We don't waste time. If there's changes in the legislation, then we'll post it on our website. We'll do a webinar about it. We will email our existing client base. We might post stuff on social media, but we don't want people phoning people up and selling our service. We don't need to. It's we're technical led, and that is the basis, So we do good work. We have a good team of people. I've worked with quite a lot of my colleagues for approaching now 15, 20 years. So we have a solid team of expertise. We do train younger people as well to come through, but it's, we're technical, as I keep saying, we're technical led, not sales led.
That's amazing. I really appreciate you sharing, like, kind of how would you do it if you do need, or if you would have that need to reach out to new prospects. But pretty much it's amazing that you got yourself in a position where you don't have to anymore. You can just specialize on what you're actually good at. And I want to expand on that technical that you're still mentioning. Like, can you give us some examples as well, or how you're leveraging tech and how you're kind of staying ahead with all the emerging trends? Of course, AI is currently a very, very huge topic. Are you leveraging that in any way, or what does tech mean to you?
Yeah. Look, tech is important to our business. And when I started this business, I was very fortunate to know someone who had been a senior tax inspector, but he was self-taught, and he was an early IT expert, and he even used to write software for banks. So he was a tax inspector on one hand, so he understood tax, and he also really understood programming to the level of writing complex mortgage software for high street banks. And he became a friend of mine, and we spent quite a lot of time sitting down to develop our own software.
Yeah.
And we developed software that we still use. The core of it has been adapted many times since. So we have very efficient internal IT software that we use and have used for nearly 30 years. And we do work with really good IT people. And sometimes we have just developed a capital allowances system for a high street retail bank where they can automate their capital allowances. So tech is really important. We try our best to keep ahead of it. And AI, we haven't really made too much use yet of AI, but it will happen. But look, tech is incredibly important to any business.
And of course, outside of just the tech that you're leveraging quite well, there's people, right? And as you mentioned, you have 15 people strong team at the moment, and there's the training element that you mentioned. So what is the kind of team composition that you have? Are they just all specialists? And maybe if you can give us some snippets of your training and recruiting, how does it work with your company?
Yeah. I would say later in my career, I realized how much importance there is for kindness. So my number one requirement for people to work in the team is that they're a kind person. If you have a kind person, then you can resolve any difficulties very easily. And I kind of wish someone sat down with me that 30 years ago and explained that. So I would say number one is a kind person. Number two, that they're hardworking and that they're willing to learn. We don't have to work ridiculous hours. We don't work weekends. We don't tend to work late in the evening apart from exceptional times because we're efficient. So I want people who are kind, people who are hardworking, people who have an appetite for learning. So if we take a graduate, they won't have studied capital allowances at university. They'll either have a finance background, they may have studied accounting, they may have studied finance, they may have studied economics, or they may have studied construction, they may have studied surveying. We will give them the training on the job, but we want them to also get external qualification. So we want them to become chartered surveyors, or we want them to, we've had people who've got qualified in the ATT tax qualification, and they've done the CTA qualification, and we had one woman who also did ACCA qualification. So we want young people to be working, to be learning, but to be bettering themselves.
And pretty much you now, with your current team composition, are able to solve any type of commercial building and any kind of capital allowance that kind of is on the UK market, right?
Completely. And we do sometimes work with other jurisdictions. So sometimes we work on US tax analysis. We'll normally partner with somebody local in the US who's got the day-to-day expertise. So
Amazing. Perfect. It was a pleasure, John. I would love to ask one last question that it's kind of my specialty with these episodes. Where do you see the capital allowance market go in the next 5 to 10 years? What are maybe your predictions? And maybe if you can share something that you preparing to kind of release or bring to the table.
yeah, it's hard to predict the future. I mean, everyone is saying there's going to be a lot more automation. And a lot more use of AI, and I'm sure that is true. But the real problem about what we do goes back to what I said, that the larger, more complex projects are very often commercially sensitive. So, if all you know is that someone spent 100 million building a facility, and if you've only got 2 lines of a breakdown on that construction cost, that is quite hard to automate. Unless you're pre-automating segregation, which is maybe possible. So, if I was to guess, yes, more use AI. There are fewer specialist firms of like my firm. What seems to happen is you've got quite a lot of one-man type firms or one-woman type firms where it's just literally one person and they have a small client base. So they've got a handful and it's like a lifestyle business for them. So I would expect those lifestyle capital allowances businesses to continue. Most of my independent competitors who just do capital allowances, they've been swallowed or they've retired or they've gone. So I suspect that you will see more of a concentration of the home working types, very small firms, and the larger firms would be my expectation.
Okay, I completely agree with the prediction because we're seeing already people utilizing AI to kind of replace their employees and to kind of run one-person business, making it into lifestyle. So that I can see happening as well with capital allowances or any kind of tax services for that extent, but really keeping it very specialized in that one or two areas.
But I hope to be around for a while. My father is 96 and still going strong, and my mother lived to be a similar age.
Awesome. So you still have bunch of time.
I enjoy what I do. I still enjoy probably as much, or if not more, what I do in this area as I have done through my career.
Yeah, and I can see that on you as well. Like this was a very pleasurable conversation, and I really love kind of how you're running things and how efficiently you've built it to have a lean team and kind of move forward quicker rather than kind of scaling that into a corporate that just kind of drags it in. And yeah, it's pretty much a dream of any kind of company to stay lean and still make good profit. So I appreciate you jumping on with us and sharing everything. And I'm hoping that maybe in couple months, couple years time, we jump on another podcast and see how you progress and how you're incorporating these trends into your existing business.
Thanks, Marcel. Appreciate it. And thank you to anyone listening.
Thank you guys as well. See you in the next one. Have a nice one. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Marcel.